The dust of the high plains settled on everything, a fine gritty powder that coated the pews, the wilting flowers, and the white silk of Alara's wedding dress. It was a shroud for a day that was supposed to be a birth. The church doors were thrown wide open, not to welcome a future, but to air out a humiliation. Every soul in Redemption Creek was there, packed into the small wooden chapel, their faces a pale, wavering sea of judgment. They had come for a wedding, the union of Alara, the schoolteacher's daughter, to Jedediah Kane, son of the wealthiest man in the county. They were getting a spectacle instead. Jedediah stood before the altar, his face ashen, his fine suit looking like a costume he was desperate to shed. He hadn't looked at her, not once, since she'd walked down the aisle on her father's trembling arm. He had waited until the preacher asked him to speak his vows, and then, in the ringing silence, he had finally turned his eyes on her. They were not the eyes of a lover. They were cold, dead stones. "I can't," he'd said, the words dropping like lead weights into the stunned air. "I can't marry her." A gasp, collective and sharp, had rippled through the crowd. Alara's father, a gentle man with ink-stained fingers and a heart too soft for this harsh land, had taken a step forward. "Jedediah, son, what is the meaning of this?" Jedediah's gaze had flickered to his own father, a granite-faced man in the front pew, whose expression was one of cold, calculated satisfaction. A silent order passed between them. Jedediah straightened, his voice gaining a cruel, rehearsed strength. "She is not pure," he announced, the word pure echoing off the raw timber walls. "She is barren. A doctor in St. Louis confirmed it to my father. She can bear no sons." The accusation was a physical blow. Alara felt the air leave her lungs, her vision tunneling until all she could see was the mocking pity on the faces. In the crowd, barren, the word was a brand, a curse whispered in the dark corners of this world where a woman's worth was measured in sons and acres. It wasn't true, not in the way he meant it. A childhood fever had left her with a delicate constitution. A doctor had once warned her mother, but barren? It had never been spoken, never been confirmed. It was a private fear, a whispered worry between her and her mother, now twisted into a public execution. Her own father looked at her, his face a mask of confusion and pain. "Alara?" he whispered, his voice cracking. She couldn't answer. The lie was too vast, too monstrous. It had been designed to annihilate her, and it was working. Jedediah wasn't finished. He was an actor in a play he hadn't written, and he was determined to play his part to the end. "My father's legacy requires an heir. I cannot tie myself to a dry well." The whispers started then, a venomous hiss that slithered through the pews. Barren knew she was too quiet, too bookish. Poor Jedediah, saved just in time. Her mother, a woman already stooped by years of quiet disappointment, began to weep, a soft, hiccuping sound that was swallowed by the growing murmur of the crowd. Jedediah turned and walked away, not down the aisle, but through a side door, disappearing like a coward into the blinding sunlight. His father, Augustus Kane, rose slowly, his presence filling the chapel with an oppressive authority. He looked at Alara, his eyes sweeping over her white dress with a look of profound disgust, as if she were something he'd found on the bottom of his boot. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He had orchestrated this perfectly. He had wanted her family's small plot of land, the one with the creek running through it, and when her father had refused to sell, he had found another way to break them. He had used his son to ruin her, to make her and her family pariahs. They would be forced to leave now. No one would hire her father. No one would speak to her mother. And she was less than nothing, a ruined woman. A barren bride left at the altar. The crowd began to disperse, shuffling out with backward glances, eager to spread the story, to feast on the carcass of her reputation. Her father put his arm around her, but his touch was hesitant, uncertain. The shame was a contagion, and they were all infected. Ilara stood frozen, the ridiculous white dress a monument to her folly. The silence that followed the exodus was worse than the whispers. It was a hollow, ringing void where her future was supposed to have been. She could feel the weight of the sky, the endless, unforgiving blue of the west, pressing down on her. She was alone, utterly and completely alone, a ghost in her own wedding dress. She closed her eyes, a single desperate prayer forming in her mind. God, if you are there, let the earth swallow me whole. The prayer went unanswered. The earth did. Not open, but as the last of the townsfolk scurried away, a shadow fell across the church doorway. A man stood there, silhouetted against the harsh afternoon light. He was tall and broad, a figure of stillness in the swirling dust. He hadn't been in the church, she would have noticed. He must have been watching from outside. He took a slow step forward and then another, his boots echoing on the wooden floorboards. As he moved out of the silhouette and into the dusty light of the chapel, she saw him, Silas Blackwood, a man who lived on the edge of the county and the edge of society, on a ranch scarred by fire and tragedy. A man whose own face was a roadmap of pain, a latticework of old burned scars that pulled at the corner of his left eye and twisted his mouth into a permanent grim line. He was a ghost of a different sort, a man haunted by the wife and child he'd lost in the fire that had marked him. He stopped a few feet from her. He smelled of pine smoke, leather, and earth. His eyes, one a clear, piercing gray, and the other slightly clouded by his scars, held no pity. They held something else, something she couldn't name. A deep, quiet understanding. He looked at her father, whose face was buried in his hands, and at her mother, who was staring at the floor as if searching for an escape. Then his gaze returned to Ilara, standing amidst the wreckage of her life. He didn't speak for a long time. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken grief. When he finally did, his voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. It was a voice that wasn't used to speaking much. "I'll take her," he said. The words were not a question. They were a statement, dropped into the void with the finality of a coffin lid closing. Her father's head snapped up, his eyes wide with disbelief. Her mother let out a small, choked gasp. Ilara stared at him, her mind struggling to catch up. Take her. What did that mean? Was this some new, crueler form of mockery? Silas's gaze did not waver. He looked directly at her, past the ruined dress, past the shame, and saw the woman trembling underneath. "There's a preacher still here, I imagine," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "He can earn his keep." It wasn't a proposal. It was a transaction. A salvage operation. He was not offering love or comfort or even kindness. He was offering an escape, a name, a roof, a way to not be the girl left at the altar. Her father found his voice, sputtering. "Sir, Mr. Blackwood, you don't understand. What they said, it's a lie, a vicious lie, but the damage is done. Her reputation." "I know what they said," Silas interrupted, his voice cutting through her father's protests. "I don't care about her reputation. I need a wife." The words hung in the air, stark and brutal in their honesty. He needed a wife, not a lover, not a companion. A wife, a pair of hands, a presence in a silent, empty house. He was buying a broken thing because he was broken too. He was offering her a life that was little more than a shared sentence. Ilara looked from the scarred, unreadable face of Silas Blackwood to the devastated faces of her parents. She saw the road ahead of them, the averted eyes in town, the whispers behind their backs, the slow, grinding poverty that would follow their disgrace. They would be forced to sell their land to Augustus Cain for pennies on the dollar. They would be broken. Silas was offering her a different kind of brokenness. A life of hardship and isolation, tied to a man who was more shadow than substance. But it was a life, it was a choice. Her choice. She took a single shaky breath, the first one that felt like it reached the bottom of her lungs. She lifted her chin, the movement small but defiant. Her voice, when it came, was a reedy whisper, but it did not tremble. "Yes," she said. The word was a tiny spark in the vast darkness. But it was enough. The preacher, a man whose face was slick with sweat and fear of the canes, performed the ceremony with trembling hands. The words were hollow, the promises empty. There was no joy, no celebration, just a quiet, grim finality. They were bound together, two broken souls, by a handful of words and a shared desperation. When it was over, Silas simply nodded, turned, and walked out of the church. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He knew she would. She had nowhere else to go. Alara paused at the door, turning to look at her parents. Her mother was crying openly now, her face a crumpled mess. Grief. Her father just looked old, as if the last hour had stolen 20 years from him. She wanted to run to them, to feel their arms around her one last time, but she couldn't. She had made her bargain. She turned and followed her new husband into the unforgiving sunlight, leaving the girl she was supposed to be lying dead on the church floor. The ride to Silas's ranch was a silent one. He rode a tall black gelding that moved with a grim purpose, and she followed on a sway-backed mar he'd procured from the livery. The dust kicked up by their horses coated her white dress, turning it a dingy, mournful gray. The landscape grew harsher, the sparse grasslands giving way to rocky outcrops and twisted, skeletal trees. It was a land that did not suffer fools or weaklings. It was a land that matched the man who led her through it. The ranch, when they finally reached it, was not a ranch at all. It was a wound on the face of the earth. The main house was a sturdy log structure, but one entire side of it was a black, charred ruin. The fire, the one that had taken his family. The roof sagged in that section, a gaping maw open to the sky. The barn was leaning, its timbers weathered and gray, half its roof missing. Fences were down, their posts askew like broken teeth. The only signs of life were a few scrawny cattle grazing on the sparse, brown grass and the wind, which howled a lonely, mournful song through the skeletal remains of the burned-out wing. This was not a home, it was a tomb. Silas dismounted and, without a word, began to unsaddle his horse. Alara slid from her own, her legs stiff and shaky. The white dress felt like a costume from another life, another world. It was absurd here, in this place of ash and sorrow. Silas led the horses to a trough, his movements economical and precise. He did not look at her. He did not speak. He was a man who had walled himself off from the world, and he had just brought a stranger inside those walls. He was not happy about it. He finished with the horses and finally turned to her. His scarred face was impossible to read. "The well is over there," he said, gesturing with his chin. "The east wing is livable. I sleep in the barn." He turned and walked toward the leaning structure, leaving her standing alone in the yard, a bride in a ruined dress in the middle of a ruined life. The east wing was one large room. It was clean, surprisingly so, but stark and empty. There was a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a bed in the corner with a simple patched quilt, and a few shelves holding tins of food and a handful of books. It was a space designed for survival, not living. There was no warmth, no touch of softness. It was the room of a man waiting to die. Alara stood in the center of it, her borrowed mare's reins still clutched in her hand. The silence was absolute, broken only by the whistling of the wind through the charred remains of the west wing. This was her new home. This was her new life. The first few days were a blur of aching muscles and silent meals. Alara, the schoolteacher's daughter who knew more about poetry than planting, found herself thrust into a world of brutal, relentless labor. Silas did not tell her what to do. He simply did what needed to be done, and she learned by watching, by following his silent lead. She traded her ruined wedding dress for a simple cotton work dress her mother had packed in a small trunk, a trunk that now seemed like a relic from a forgotten civilization. She learned to mend fences, her soft hands quickly becoming calloused and raw. She learned to milk their one bony cow, to churn butter, to bake bread in the stone fireplace that was as much a source of frustration as it was of warmth. She learned the language of this place, a language of aching backs, sweat, and the gnawing ache of hunger. Silas was a relentless worker. He rose before the sun and worked until long after it had set. He moved with a grim, tireless energy, as if he were trying to outrun the ghosts that haunted him. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his words were clipped and practical. The wood needs chopping. The roof is leaking. The cattle are thin. They ate their meals in silence, sitting at opposite ends of the rough-hewn table. The space between them was a chasm, filled with unspoken pain and the ghosts of the people they have lost. Ilara would sometimes catch him staring into the fire, his scarred face illuminated by the flames, his one good eye seeing things she could only imagine. She knew he was thinking of his wife, his child, the life that had been turned to ash. In those moments, she felt a pang of something that was not pity, but a shared, desolate understanding. She was a ghost in his house, and he was a ghost in his own life. One evening, a week after her arrival, a storm rolled in, a violent, furious tempest that shook the small cabin to its foundations. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled like a banshee. A loud crack echoed from outside, followed by the sound of splintering wood. Silas was on his feet in an instant, grabbing a lantern. "The barn roof," he said, his voice tight. He was out the door before she could say a word. Ilara hesitated for only a moment. Then, pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders, she followed him into the raging storm. The wind tore at her, the rain blinding her, but she kept her eyes fixed on the bobbing light of his lantern. She found him in the barn, struggling to pull a heavy canvas over the section of the roof that had finally given way. The rain was pouring in, soaking the hay and threatening the small store of grain they had. He was trying to do it alone, his body straining against the weight of the wet canvas and the force of the wind. "I'll help," she shouted over the roar of the storm. He turned, his face a mask of surprise and something else. Annoyance? He didn't want her help. He didn't want her here. "Go back to the house," he yelled back. "I can manage." But she didn't go back. She grabbed a corner of the heavy canvas, her small frame struggling against its weight. "You can't," she shouted, her voice thin but determined. "Not alone." For a moment, they were locked in a silent battle of wills, the storm raging around them. Then with a grim nod, he relented. Together, they fought the wind and the rain, their bodies working in a clumsy, unpracticed rhythm. They were soaked to the bone, their hands numb with cold, but they managed to secure the canvas, to protect what little they had. When it was done, they stood in the relative quiet of the barn, dripping and shivering, the sound of the rain now. A dull roar on the makeshift roof. Silas looked at her, his chest heaving. In the flickering lantern light, she saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. A crack in the wall he had built around himself. A flicker of grudging respect. He didn't say thank you. The words were not in him. But he took off his own dry coat from a peg on the wall and draped it over her shivering shoulders. It was heavy and smelled of him, of smoke and pine and sweat. It was the first act of kindness he had shown her. It was a beginning. The town of Redemption Creek did not forget. When they were forced to ride in for supplies, the whispers followed them like a plague. Ilara would keep her eyes fixed forward, her back straight, her face a mask of calm indifference she did not feel. She could feel the stares, the pitying glances from the women, the leering smirks from the men. There's the barren bride. Blackwood bought himself a wife. 2 broken souls in 1 broken home, fitting. Augustus Cain and his son, Jedediah, made a point of being seen whenever they were in town. Jedediah would look at her with a mixture of guilt and contempt. His new fiancée, a simpering girl from a neighboring town, clinging to his arm. Augustus would simply stare, his eyes cold and hard, a silent reminder of his power, of the humiliation he had inflicted. One day, as Alara was leaving the general store, her arms laden with flour and salt, Jedediah's new fiancé blocked her. "Path, I do feel for you," the girl said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "To be so unwanted." Alara stopped. She looked at the girl, at her perfect dress and her smug, pretty face. A year ago, a week ago, she would have shrunk from the cruelty. She would have fled in shame. But something had changed in her. The hard labor, the silent companionship of the scarred man she was tied to, the daily struggle for survival. It had forged something new in her. A core of steel she didn't know she possessed. She met the girl's gaze and smiled, a small tight smile that did not reach her eyes. "It is better to be unwanted by a man of no character," she said, her voice clear and steady, "than to be wanted by one." The girl's face flushed with anger and surprise. Before she could retort, Alara stepped around her and walked away, her head held high. She didn't look back, but she could feel the eyes of the town on her. For the first time, the whispers were not just of pity, but of a grudging admiration. Not everyone was against them. The blacksmith, a burly man with a kind face, always had a quiet word for Silas, a nod of respect for Alara. An old native woman who lived in the hills, known only as Mourning Dove, would sometimes leave a bundle of medicinal herbs on their porch, a silent offering of solidarity. These small acts of kindness were anchors in a sea of hostility. They were reminders that they were not entirely alone. The work on the ranch continued, a relentless, back-breaking rhythm. They repaired the barn roof properly, Silas teaching her how to saw and hammer, his large, scarred hands guiding her smaller, calloused ones. The clumsy silence between them began to fill with the sounds of shared labor. They didn't talk about their pasts. They didn't talk about their feelings. They talked about the weather, the cattle, the stubborn patch of earth they were trying to turn into a garden. One evening, as they were sitting by the fire, Alara was reading one of the few books on Silas's shelf, a worn copy of Shakespeare. He was sharpening a knife, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone, a familiar sound in the quiet room. "My wife, she loved to read," he said, his voice so low she almost didn't hear it. Alara looked up, her heart skipping a beat. He had never spoken of his wife before. "She would read to our daughter every night," he continued, his eyes fixed on the blade in his hands. "Even when she was just a babe." He fell silent, the memory a heavy presence in the room. Alara didn't know what to say. The grief was his, a sacred, private thing. She simply closed her book and waited. "The fire," he said, his voice thick with a pain that was still raw, still bleeding. "It started in the nursery. The lamp, it must have fallen." He stopped, his knuckles white as he gripped the knife. "I tried to get to them. I tried." Alara could see it then, the story written in the scars on his face, in the haunted look in his eyes. He had run into the flames, a desperate, futile act of love. He had failed to save them, but he had carried the fire with him ever since. She reached out, her hand hovering over his for a moment, before she gently placed it on his arm. His muscles were rigid, coiled tight with years of unshed grief. He flinched at her touch, but he didn't pull away. "It wasn't your fault." "Silas," she whispered, the words inadequate, but all she had to offer. He looked at her then, his one good eye shimmering with unshed tears. He didn't speak. He just nodded, a single jerky movement. The wall between them had not crumbled, but a stone had been loosened. They were no longer just 2 broken people sharing a roof. They were two people who had seen the darkness in each other's souls and had not looked away. The first snows of winter came early that year, blanketing the wounded land in a deceptive layer of white purity. The work became harder, the isolation more profound. But something was shifting between them. The silence was no longer a chasm, but a comfortable space. They had found a rhythm, a quiet dance of survival. Alara had brought a small measure of life back into the desolate cabin. She had planted herbs in a window box, their green shoots a defiant splash of color against the gray landscape. She had mended the quilt on the bed, her neat stitches a stark contrast to the rough-hewn world around her. She had even convinced Silas to help her repair the broken panes in the windows of the burned-out west wing, letting light into the darkness for the first time in years. They were not husband and wife in the way the world understood it. They were partners. They were survivors. And in the harsh, unforgiving crucible of the frontier, that was a bond more powerful than any spoken vow. The thaw came not just in the land but in their lives. The spring was a riot of life, the brown hills turning a vibrant green, the creek swelling with melted snow. Their small herd of cattle was growing, a few new calves wobbling on unsteady legs. The garden they had fought so hard to cultivate was beginning to sprout, the promise of a harvest to come. One afternoon, as Alara was weeding the garden, a rider approached. It was Augustus Kane. He dismounted, his expensive suit and polished boots an obscene intrusion in their world of dirt and labor. "Ma'am," he said, his voice oozing a false politeness that set her teeth on edge. "I've come with a business proposition for your husband." Silas emerged from the barn, his face a thundercloud. He wiped his hands on a rag and stood beside Alara, his presence a solid, unmovable wall. "What do you want, Kane?" he asked, his voice flat and cold. "I want this land," Augustus said, gesturing around him with a dismissive wave of his hand. "It's no secret you're struggling. I'm prepared to make you a generous offer, enough for you to start over somewhere else, somewhere less demanding." "This land is not for sale," Silas said, his voice low and dangerous. Augustus chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Everything is for sale, Blackwood. It's just a matter of finding the right price, or the right pressure." He pulled a sheaf of papers from his coat pocket. "I've had my lawyers look into the title of this property. It seems your claim is not as solid as you might think. There are irregularities, unpaid taxes from years ago, a disputed boundary line. It was a lie, a fabrication, but a dangerous one." Augustus Kane owned the judge, the sheriff, the whole damn county. He could make any lie the truth. "You're a thief and a liar," Silas growled, taking a step forward. Alara put a hand on his arm, her touch a silent plea for caution. "My offer stands for 1 week," Augustus said, his eyes glinting with malice. "After that, I'll be forced to take legal action. And we both know how that will end." He turned his gaze on Alara, his smile turning cruel. "A word of advice, ma'am. Don't tie yourself to a sinking ship. I'm sure a woman of your limited prospects could find a better situation." The insult was meant to wound her, to remind her of her shame. But it didn't. She looked at the powerful, corrupt man before her, and she felt nothing but contempt. She had faced public humiliation, starvation, and the ghosts of a haunted past. His words were nothing. "This is my home," she said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she had. "And this is my husband. We are not for sale." Augustus Kane's face hardened, his mask of civility slipping. He stared at her, at the dirt on her dress and the defiance in her eyes, and for the first time, he seemed to see her not as a ruined victim, but as an adversary. He mounted his horse, his movements stiff with anger. "You'll regret this," he snarled, before spurring his horse and riding away, leaving a cloud of dust and menace in his wake. The threat hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. They were going to lose everything. The home they had clawed back from the ashes. The life they had built together, one painful, silent day at a time. Silas stood staring after Cain, his body rigid with a helpless rage. He had fought fire, grief, and his own demons. But how could he fight a man who owned the law? He turned and walked away, not to the barn, but to the charred ruins of the West Wing. Ilara followed him. She found him standing in what was once the nursery, his large frame silhouetted against the gaping hole in the roof. He was touching the blackened wood of a cradle, the only piece of furniture that had survived the flames, a skeletal, heartbreaking relic. "I can't lose this place, Ilara," he whispered, his voice breaking. "It's all I have left of them." "We won't lose it," she said, her voice fierce. He turned to her, his face a mask of despair. "How? He owns the town. He'll crush us." "No," she said, stepping closer to him. "He won't, because he's a bully and a coward, and he's underestimated us." She looked around the ruined room, at the ashes and the ghosts. This was a place of death, of unbearable loss. But it was also a place of survival, a place of strength. "We're going to fight him, Silas," she said, her eyes meeting his. "Together." In that moment, standing in the ashes of his past, something profound shifted between them. He looked at her, at this woman who had been brought to him in shame and ruin, this woman who had worked beside him, fought beside him, and who now stood ready to face down the most powerful man in the county for him. He saw not a barren bride, not a broken thing he had salvaged. He saw a warrior. He saw his wife. He reached out and, for the first time, he took her hand. His scarred, calloused fingers wrapped around hers, a silent, binding promise. They were not just partners in survival anymore. They were a family. And they would fight for it. The town meeting was held in the very church where Ilara had been abandoned. The air was thick with tension, the pews packed with the same faces that had watched her humiliation. Augustus Cain sat in the front, flanked by the sheriff and a slick lawyer from the city. He looked confident, smug, the cat that had cornered the mouse. Silas and Ilara sat alone on the other side, a small island in a sea of hostile or indifferent faces. Silas was stiff and uncomfortable in his clean but worn Sunday clothes, his scarred face a mask of grim determination. Ilara sat beside him, her back straight, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She was terrified, but she would not let it show. The meeting began, a farce of legal proceedings orchestrated by Cain's lawyer. He presented his manufactured evidence, the forged documents, the paid witnesses who spoke of unpaid taxes and disputed boundaries. It was a web of lies, expertly woven. When he was finished, the judge, a man whose pockets were lined with Cain's money, looked at Silas. "Mr. Blackwood, do you have anything to say in your defense?" Silas stood up, his large frame seeming to shrink in the oppressive atmosphere. He was a man of action, not words. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He was drowning in the sea of hostile faces, in the weight of the injustice. He looked at Ilara, his eyes filled with a desperate apology. He was failing her. He was failing them. Ilara stood up. A murmur went through the crowd. The ruined woman was going to speak. She walked to the front of the church, her steps steady and sure. She did not look at the judge or the lawyer. She looked at the people of Redemption Creek. "My name is Ilara Blackwood," she began, her voice clear and strong, ringing through the silent chapel. "Many of you were here, in this very room, 6 months ago. You watched as Jedediah Cain, at the behest of his father, cast me aside and declared me barren and worthless." A flush of shame or discomfort passed through the crowd. She had their attention. "He did it to break me, to break my family, so that his father could steal our land. It was a cruel and cowardly act, and it was based on a lie." She turned her gaze on Jedediah, who was sitting beside his father, his face pale and sweating. Jedediah, do you remember the fever I had as a child? The one that nearly took me? My mother nursed me back to health. She sat by my bed for weeks. Your mother, she brought us broth. She held my hand. Jedediah stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. After the fever, the doctor told my mother that I might have difficulty, she continued, her voice softening. That bearing children might be a struggle. It was a possibility, a fear. Not a certainty. It was a private family matter. But you and your father, you twisted that fear into a public condemnation. You branded me as barren to serve your own greed. She then turned to Augustus Cain, her eyes flashing with a fire he had not expected. And now you are doing it again. You are using lies and forged documents to try and steal another piece of land, the home of a man whose only crime is that he stood up when no one else would. A man who gave a shamed woman a home in his name. She paused, letting her words sink in. The silence in the church was absolute. You call my husband a squatter and a tax evader. I call him a good man, a man of honor, a man who fought a fire to save his family and bears the scars of that love on his face. What scars do you bear, Mr. Cain, other than the ones on your soul? The accusation hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. The people in the pews were no longer looking at her with pity or contempt. They were looking at Augustus Cain with a new dawning suspicion. The blacksmith stood up, his voice a low rumble. I've known Silas Blackwood for 10 years. He's a quiet man, but he's an honest one. He's paid his taxes every year. I've seen him do it myself at the general store. Mourning Dove, the old native woman, who rarely came to town, stood up from the back of the church. Her face was a mask of ancient wisdom. The land of the scarred man is sacred, she said, her voice carrying a strange authority. It has been watered with tears and ashes. The spirits of his wife and child watch over it. To steal it is to invite a curse upon your own house. A shiver went through the crowd. In this land, where life was precarious and the veil between worlds was thin, such words held weight. The tide was turning. The web of lies was unraveling. Augustus Cain's face was purple with rage. This is absurd. The law is the law, he bellowed. Then let us see the law, Ilara said, her voice cutting through his rage. She walked to the front pew and picked up the Bible that lay there. She held it up. We are in a house of God. Let us speak the truth before him, Jedediah. She sighed, her eyes locking with her former fiancé's. Swear on this Bible. Swear that you did not lie about me. Swear that your father did not force you to do it. Swear it, and I will walk away and never speak of it again. All eyes turned to Jedediah. He was trapped. He looked at his father's furious face, then at Ilara's calm, unwavering gaze. He was a weak man, a coward, but even he had a breaking point. He couldn't do it. He couldn't commit such a blatant sacrilege in front of the entire town. He dropped his gaze to the floor, his shoulders slumping in defeat. I can't, he whispered. The admission was a thunderclap. The crowd erupted in a chorus of gasps and angry murmurs. Augustus Cain was on his feet, his face a mask of fury, but it was too late. His power, built on fear and intimidation, had crumbled. He had been exposed. The judge, seeing which way the wind was blowing, quickly banged his gavel. This meeting is adjourned, he declared. The claim against Mr. Blackwood is dismissed. It was over. They had won. The crowd surrounded them, not with whispers and judgment, but with slaps on the back for Silas, with words of admiration for Ilara. They had come to the church as outcasts. They were leaving as heroes. As they walked out into the sunlight, Silas stopped and turned to her. His scarred face was a mixture of awe and something else, something deeper. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his rough fingers surprisingly tender. You saved us, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. No, she said, her hand covering his. We saved each other. They rode back to the ranch not in silence, but in a shared, quiet joy. The land seemed different, the colors brighter, the air cleaner. It was theirs. Truly theirs. Not by law, not by paper, but by the right of the heart, by the sweat and tears they had poured into its soil. That evening, they did not eat at opposite ends of the table. They sat close together, their shoulders almost touching. After the meal, Silas took her hand and led her outside. The sky was a blaze of orange and purple, the setting sun painting the clouds with fire. He led her to the charred west wing, to the gaping hole that had been a wound in their home for so long. "I'm going to rebuild it," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm going to make it a home again." He looked at her, his one good eye shining with a love that needed no words. "Our home." Elara's eyes filled with tears, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of a joy so profound it was almost painful. She looked at the ruined wing, and she did not see ashes and ghosts. She saw a future. She saw a nursery with a new cradle, not a broken one. She saw rooms filled with light and laughter. She saw a life. "I know," she said, her voice a whisper. "And I'll help you." A few days later, a wagon pulled up to the ranch. It was the blacksmith, his wife beside him. He had a load of fresh-cut timber in the back. "Thought you might need this," he said with a gruff smile. Soon, other wagons arrived. Neighbors, people from the town. They brought tools, food, and willing hands. The community that had once shunned them now came to help them rebuild. They had not just won a legal battle. They had won the heart of the town. The work was hard, but it was joyful. The sound of hammers and saws replaced the mournful whistle of the wind. Laughter echoed where there had once been only silence. Elara worked alongside the women, providing food and drink, her face glowing with a happiness she had never known. Silas worked with the men, his quiet strength earning their deep respect. He was no longer Silas Blackwood, the scarred recluse. He was a man among men, a leader, a husband. One evening, after the last of the helpers had gone home, Silas and Elara stood on their porch, watching the new walls of the west wing rise against the twilight sky. The house was no longer a tomb. It was becoming whole again. Just like them. Silas turned to her, his face serious in the fading light. "Elara," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "What we have, it was born of hardship and necessity. I never asked you if this is what you wanted. If you could be happy here, with me." Elara looked at him, at this strong, silent man who had offered her his name when she had nothing left. This man who had stood by her, fought for her, and who was now rebuilding a future from the ashes of his past. She thought of the girl in the white dress, the girl who had dreamed of a different life, a life of ease and comfort. That girl was a stranger to her now. She smiled, a real radiant smile that transformed her face. She reached up and traced the line of the scar on his cheek, her touch gentle and loving. "Silas," she said, her voice soft but sure. "There was a time when I thought happiness was a place without scars." She looked around at their healing home, at the rugged, beautiful land that had tested them and forged them into something new. She looked into his eyes, at the love and strength reflected there. "Now I know it's the place where they are understood." He pulled her into his arms, his embrace fierce and protective. He buried his face in her hair, and she could feel the tremors that ran through his powerful frame. He was a man who had not allowed himself to hope for a second chance at happiness. And now it was here, in his arms. They stood there for a long time, holding each other as the first stars began to appear in the vast dark sky. They were two broken souls who had found each other in the ruins. They had taken the shattered pieces of their lives and, with calloused hands and stubborn hearts, they had built a love that was stronger than stone, more resilient than steel. They were not just survivors, they were home. And under the endless, watchful sky of the west, they stood together, no longer broken, but finally, miraculously, whole.